History as it happens, June 28, 2022. In the shadow of Watergate.
At first, the police found nothing. Then they spied 5 men crouching behind some desk.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities.
It is my honest belief that while the president was involved, that he did not realize or appreciate.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
A president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution.
Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Our long national nightmare is over.
The hearings are exposing the facts behind a scheme to interfere in an election, driven by a president who's lost his bearings, fixated on false conspiracies. It's a story of corruption, dishonesty, and abuse of power. Is it Watergate or Stop the Steal? The scandals are united by similarities, but there are important differences too, as we reflect on the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in to try to make sense of the present. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There's no way I lost Georgia. There's no way. We won by hundreds of thousands of votes.
We've already seen how President Trump falsely declared victory on November 3rd, 2020.
That you can remove the electors of President Biden and replace them.
Either of those divisions have any role whatsoever in investigating election fraud, sir?
No.
In fact, Donald Trump knew this was a lie.
He responded very quickly and said, essentially, that's not what I'm asking you to do. What I'm just asking you to do is just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican Congress.
Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
Anniversaries have a way of concentrating our minds on an old story. Sometimes an old story needs a fresh pair of eyes to bring new insights to the surface, so we can hold it up to the mirror of current events. Well, past and present are intersecting right now. As the House committee investigating January 6 continues its hearings, we're learning there was a lot more to the Stop the Steal campaign than the Capitol riot. It also involved pressuring state-level election officials to cancel Joe Biden's win and pressuring the Department of Justice to declare the 2020 election was a fraud. For instance, President Trump planned to install a DOJ official named Jeffrey Clark to be his acting attorney general in the waning days of his term, so Clark could spread the lie that the election was stolen. As Richard Donahue, a former federal prosecutor, testified under questioning from Congresswoman Lynn Cheney.
And when you learned that he had been calling witnesses and conducting investigations on his own, did you confront him?
Yes.
And what was his reaction?
He got very defensive. As I said, there were a series of conversations through that week. I certainly remember very specifically the conversation in the meeting on January 2nd. That got even more confrontational, but he was defensive and, similar to his earlier reaction when I said this is nothing less than Justice Department meddling in an election. His reaction was, I think a lot of people have meddled in this election. And so he kind of clung to that and then spewed out some of these theories, some of which we'd heard from the president, but others which were floating around the internet and media.
You can hear echoes of Trump's scheme in the smoking gun tapes that did in Nixon. A week after the Watergate break-in, the FBI discovered a check in the bank account of one of the burglars. The check was evidence that the plumbers, as they were named, were paid from Nixon campaign funds. And on the tape, you can hear White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman getting Nixon's permission to try to stop the investigation by telling the CIA to get the FBI to butt out.
But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this.
Pat Gray, the acting head of the FBI. Just call him and say, stay the hell out of this. A president using the Department of Justice to interfere in an election. Yes, the Watergate break-in was part of Nixon's larger scheme to damage the Democrats ahead of the 1972 election. Now, each scandal paints the picture of a rogue executive willing to do almost anything to remain in power. but their respective times were so much different. There was no 24/7 cable news or Twitter in 1972. There was no personality cult surrounding Richard Milhouse Nixon, who became a political pariah after resigning, while Donald Trump remains the de facto leader of the Republican Party, and he could win the GOP nomination again. Now imagine if Nixon had tried to run in 1976. Maybe the most important thing we can learn here is the way we often remember Watergate, despite its enduring significance, misses a big part of the story, a mistake we might try to avoid as we watch the rest of the January 6 hearings. Garrett Graff is a prolific journalist and historian whose work has appeared in major publications and best-selling books, including Watergate, A New History. Garrett Graff, it's great to have you. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start by asking you what's been going through your mind as you've been watching the January 6 hearings. You have an encyclopedic knowledge of Watergate. Have any of the revelations or moments reminded you of Nixon's scandal?
Very much so. I think that there are a lot of interesting analogs between the January 6th experience and the Watergate experience. You know, one of the things that I really tried to do in my Watergate book was we incorrectly think of Watergate as an event. We think of it as the burglary on June 17th, 1972. And what we now understand is that Watergate is more a mindset, a distinct set of about a dozen interrelated but distinct scandals that unfolded throughout the Nixon presidency, sort of all stemming from this dark, paranoid, criminal, conspiratorial mindset that Richard Nixon brought to the White House and brought to his administration. And one of the things that we see in January 6th is that the Trump administration in many ways is all the same story. There is a direct line, a thread that unfolds from the Russian attack on the 2016 election to the Mueller investigation, the president's attempts to obstruct justice in that investigation, the Zelensky telephone call that led to the first impeachment, the attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the election, and then ultimately to the president's lies, and then this attempt that the January 6th committee is investigating the extent to which the president led an attempt to undermine the peaceful transition of power. That it's sort of in the same way that Nixon's crimes all fall under this umbrella of paranoid, criminal, conspiratorial mindset, we sort of see that same style unfolding in the Trump presidency.
And Watergate was about the 1972 election. We seem to have lost sight of that. Not you, obviously, but in the public memory, right? We don't think of 1972 election because Nixon clobbered McGovern, but he was concerned about it.
One of the things that I was able to do coming back to this story 50 years later is understand it in a context that wasn't obvious then. Watergate is not just about the 72 election, it's about the 68 election as well. In the 68 election, what you saw was a series of events that we've only come to understand in the last decade that's known as the Chenault affair, which was this attempt by Richard Nixon and his campaign manager, John Mitchell, to work with a Washington doyen named Anna Chenault to undermine the Paris peace talks. Lyndon Johnson, fall of 68, is sort of desperately trying to bring the Vietnam War to a close. Richard Nixon, former vice president, battling for the presidency along with Hubert Humphrey, the sitting vice president, and Nixon, with Anna Chenault, effectively intervenes to stall the Paris peace talks and to keep the Vietnam War going for his own political benefit. And one of the things that we now understand is, these are some of the most credible allegations effectively approaching outright treason that we have against any major political figure in American history. Johnson finds this out in the final hours of the election, confronts Richard Nixon, and Nixon denies the whole thing. And the clock runs out and Nixon wins. And Johnson decides, for the good of the country, that he needs to bury the whole thing. He classifies all the documents related to it and buries the whole thing. This becomes sort of the secret at the heart of the Nixon White House, this Edgar Allan Poe telltale heart style thing where Nixon doesn't know that Johnson isn't going to do anything with this. And so Nixon knows that Johnson knows, and he becomes terrified that this treachery is going to come out at some point. And so he is driven wild as the Pentagon Papers come out in the spring of 71, and eventually brings in the plumbers, G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and their crazy team. And in the summer of 71, in reaction to the Pentagon Papers, he is on the White House tapes ordering the only burglary where he's actually caught on tape ordering a burglary, which is not the Watergate burglary in 72. It is the burglary of the Brookings Institution in the summer of 71.
Which never happened, but we hear Nixon.
Never happens.
That's right. We hear Nixon on the tape saying, I want it done on a thievery basis.
Exactly.
I want it implemented on a thievery basis. Goddamn, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
And they come up with this crazy plan where they want to break in using the same team of Cuban burglars that they end up using in 72 at the Watergate. They are going to dress them up as DC firefighters, equip them with a DC fire truck, and firebomb the Brookings Institution. Under the chaos of the firefighting, send this burglary team in to steal back the papers at the Brookings Institution that Nixon thinks involve the Chenault affair. And what's sort of weird about this is that there's no proof that these documents ever existed.
Right.
That
Nixon's paranoia working here.
And so Nixon ends up repeatedly ordering this burglary at the Brookings Institution and trying to retrieve these Chenault papers, and ends up creating the plumbers unit to sort of try to keep this secret. And these guys sort of spin out of control and end up at the Watergate so many years later.
Anna Chenault, if we can rewind for a moment, she was the widow of Claire Chenault, who was a World War II American commander, and she had been very angry about the loss of China. She was among the Republicans who blamed the Democrats for losing China in 1949, as if it was theirs to lose. So she was an anti-communist fanatic. And as you mentioned, she works with Nixon to interfere in the ongoing bombing halt negotiations in 68 because they were helping Humphrey. The prospect of stopping the bombing and reaching some kind of peace deal were helping Humphrey catch up to Nixon in the polls. And Nixon interferes in that because he promises, I think, the South Vietnamese not to strike a deal now because you can get a better deal with me. I mean, he interferes as a private citizen. He wasn't in office at that time.
Again, these are sort of the types of revelations that we now only understand with 50 years of newly declassified documents, newly released files from the Johnson administration, and that it helps us, I think, understand Watergate, Vietnam, Pentagon Papers. These were not three separate events. This was all one thread, all one story that unfolds in the heart of the Nixon administration.
And in both cases, we're dealing with presidents who seem to have lost their bearings, and this directly relates to the issue of whether Donald Trump committed a crime and could potentially be charged with a crime. Nixon clearly knew what he was doing was against the law. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We know that from even listening to him on the tapes, right?
As he said in the Nixon-Frost interviews later, if the president does it, it's not illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
Trump, though, right? There is this issue being debated now about whether he knew what he was doing was illegal, pressuring the Justice Department to declare the 2020 election was corrupt, calling state-level election officials, telling them to find votes, pressuring state legislatures to seat fake electors who would, I guess, show up on the day of January 6th and say, we're the real electors from state X, Y, and Z. But Trump apparently continued to insist, based on what we know from his conversations with Bill Barr and others, that he didn't believe what his advisors were telling him. He really believes, in his mind, the election was stolen. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that One of the things that has been surprising to me about the January 6th hearings is the extent to which Donald Trump really clearly knew that what he was doing was illegal, was told that very consistently. One of the things that really comes through in this is just how isolated Donald Trump was in those final weeks, that he had his most senior aides, the vice president's most senior aides, all telling him, this isn't right, you can't do this, this is not legal. And he persisted. And that, to me, I think is one of the pieces of evidence that really comes clear in the January 6th hearings in a way that has been very surprising to me.
When it comes to Watergate, to your initial answer about it being not an event, but part of a larger pattern, it also became something that was in the air that Americans breathed for 2 years, right? I mean, the Watergate hearings themselves, and this is well before the House Judiciary Committee holds impeachment hearings. There were Senate hearings on Watergate that, of course, discovered that Nixon had a taping system, right? They covered 51 days from May to November 1973. And the public along the way, of course, because of reporting by Bernstein and Woodward, among others, were learning a lot of what was going on as this was all unfolding. There were a lot of crimes already revealed, right? But in the end, it took the revelation of the tapes to do in Nixon. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it was the accumulation of the lies, the sense that Nixon had misled the American people, he had misled his aides, he had misled his allies. One of the things that really comes through in Watergate that is, I think, sort of surprising looking back on it is the extent to which that Americans just didn't expect that Richard Nixon would lie to them. There was a moment when sort of our faith and trust in institutions was so different. And you saw this even with Democrats in the midst of Watergate saying, look, we trust Nixon because he said he didn't have anything to do with this.
And you believed your president.
We believed your president. We can't impeach the president. He's our president. And so in a weird way, the loss of faith in institutions, the sort of cynicism that Nixon introduced into American politics has made every subsequent presidential scandal less shocking to us. His effect has basically been it's easier for every president since him to survive the types of misdeeds that that sunk Richard Nixon, because now we sort of expect our presidents to be lying to us.
Well, I can't disagree with that. According to my notes here, 40 government officials were indicted or jailed as a result of the Watergate investigation. It's not clear anyone's going to go to jail because of what happened with the Stop the Steal scheme, which again was not just a riot on January 6th. If anything, that was the end point, right? I'd like your thoughts on the following. A major difference between the two eras. I referred to the tapes earlier in my question. When the tapes came out, that was it. Nixon could not deny any longer. In this case, though, we're dealing with a different media ecosystem. And if the polls are correct, a lot of people still believe that Donald Trump did nothing wrong here.
I think that Nixon, had Fox News and the media ecosystem existed, he would have survived. There was not the system to defend him in the way that President Trump is defended on Fox News. And there's not the systemic media environment that lets him punish the people who are investigating him. We would feel very differently about Sam Ervin and Pete Rodino now if they were sort of given the Fox News treatment.
Of course, it was an intense environment even then, and Republicans stuck with Nixon for quite a while until they couldn't any longer. I want to ask you about that. We all have heard the famous story about Barry Goldwater and some others going to Nixon and saying, that's it. If you don't resign, you will be impeached and convicted. But what do you think might have happened had Nixon decided to fight it out in a Senate trial?
He thought about this. He thought that he could sort of get there. It really wasn't until the smoking gun tapes came out that he felt that he had lost the chance to have the support that he needed in the House and the Senate. from his own party. He thought he might very well make it through the initial phase of a Senate hearing right up until that smoking gun tape came out in August of 1974.
Watergate special prosecutor at the time, Leon Jaworski, he wasn't really showing an inclination to press charges against Nixon as a private citizen, was he?
No, and I think that he's probably the person second most thankful in the country to Richard Nixon for the pardon.
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true.
Gerald Ford's pardon saved him a lot of angst about whether there was justice to be done in bringing an indictment against a former president. And by the way, I think, in many ways, the Leon Jaworski conundrum, if you want to call it that, is what we are now witnessing Merrick Garland struggle with. There are a lot of reasons why it's really hard to charge a former president of the United States.
I'm not an attorney. I do not play one on my podcast. I'm not a psychiatrist either, so I can't tell you what's going on really in Donald Trump's head. But Garrett Graff, as a journalist and historian who has studied Watergate, what are your feelings on whether we might see charges against Trump? I think it's a long shot, but
I would have said that too, except that I think that the January 6th committee is making a really clear case to me, again, as a non-lawyer, that there was criminal intent, that this wasn't Donald Trump using what he saw as the tools available to him to document an actually believable fraud, that he was sort of told all along, there's nothing to this, and what you're doing is illegal, and this is outside the bounds of normal government. That's one of the things that is really remarkable about the January 6th hearings, is the extent to which we are seeing that as a consistent message.
How close did you come to determining who ordered the Watergate break-in? Or is that going to be a mystery forever?
I think it ends up being a mystery forever. There's new evidence. Actually, Jim Robineau just came out in the Washington Post with new evidence that he points to on some Halderman tapes that it was, in fact, John Mitchell. I think the evidence is a little bit inconclusive because, to me, there's a question of whether Mitchell was actually approving the burglary or sort of the whole system of dirty tricks, which we sort of knew he had been involved in already.
That's right.
There's still a pretty open question of who approved and for what purpose the actual burglars at the actual Watergate.
And that was the second break-in at the Watergate. The first one was to put in bugs and taping machines.
Yeah, and so they were coming. It is one of the sort of funny details of the whole thing is that this was the second Watergate burglary, and that they were actually coming back to sort of fix the problems of the first burglary. One of the things that we now understand is that they were also that night planning to, if they had succeeded at the Watergate, they would have actually gone on and burglarized George McGovern's headquarters as well. There's an interesting historical question to me of if they weren't caught then, would they have been caught at another dirty trick later?
Yeah, it seems like the plumbers had a long leash. And I want to talk about the plumbers a little bit in context here. It wasn't just a third-rate burglary. The President of the United States gave himself his own personal police force that was answerable only to him.
Yeah, and it's part of the Cubans' defense, the burglars' defense at trial was basically like, this was the White House that was employing us. This was the president. We saw Howard Hunt's White House stationery. We believed that we were doing official government business basically right up until the moment the DC police arrested us.
We can wrap up here with the following. You've obviously made it a point to impress upon your readers and here on this podcast that we have to look at Watergate with a wider lens, right? That there is so much more to it than just a break-in. And one of the lessons of Watergate, why it has such enduring significance, is it taught us what can happen when an executive abuses his power and get away with it, as Nixon did for 2 years, and he did win the 1972 election. A writer by the name of Grant Tudor, writing in The Atlantic, said, the way that Watergate has been remembered still misses the point. He says it was the campaign involving extorting corporate executives for cash, using laundered money to finance political espionage operations, treating government agencies as the political playthings of the Nixon administration, as the Senate report described them, to promote the president's reelection, conspiring to pervert the powers of certain agencies, including the Department of Justice, FBI, IRS, and FCC, to harass perceived enemies, especially members of the media, using espionage materials from the CIA, which is not supposed to operate within the United States, and it goes on and on and on, falsifying federal records. I mean, this does smack of stop the steal, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think to me, one of the things that stands out is, and you're absolutely right that that's a much broader indictment of Nixon than we normally understand. At the same time, to me, what unites Nixon's crimes is that they were crimes against the American people, that they were abuses of power, that they were weaponizing government against political enemies. Trump's crime, I think we now understand, was really a crime against democracy. And that, to me, is a very different order of magnitude of seriousness that I think we need to wrestle with in a very different way from Richard Nixon.
Garrett Graff, author of Watergate, A New History. Thank you for joining us as we just marked the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're coming up on the 4th of July, and we're going to take a look at one of the most stirring, important speeches ever given on the 4th of July by Frederick Douglass in 1852. James Oakes returns next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.